Redditors who have worked around death, burial. What's your best ghost story? Honestly, the only creepy thing that happened when I worked in the morgue is that one of the staff killed himself in there, and I just can't imagine wanting to die in this cold, gray place surrounded by corpses. Not a worker in that field. But when my dad was in the hospital, I turned off the ringer on my phone and fell asleep. About 1 a.m. I heard the doorbell ring. I got up. No one was at the door. I walked around the house and saw absolutely nothing. I checked my phone and turned on the ringer. Almost immediately the hospital called to tell me my dad had died and would it be okay to harvest some of his organs for transplant. Corpses move when you cremate them. People who don't know this get spooked a lot. I used to be a driver for a funeral home corporation. Like, drive the hearse and pick up the bodies. Never had anything creepy happen. A few funny things. A few traumatic things. In general, it was a chill job. However, I did get incredibly uncomfortable one night picking up a man who died at home. He still had the defibrillator leads on his chest and his eyes were closed, which is unusual because the eyes are always open. He just looked like he was asleep or unconscious. Not rigid or pale or anything. I just had this sinking feeling for about half an hour in traffic that he was going to suddenly gasp and wake up in the body bag. Then it hit me. That would be the coolest thing ever. I'd take him home and he'd be back with his family. So I just kind of drove slowly and turned up some music and sang along and talked to him. When I got him to the funeral home, I left him out of the cooler for about an hour while I did paperwork and played on my phone. When I got another call, I checked on him and his limbs had started to stiffen. I was kinda bummed. I put him in the cooler and went on my next call. During my apprenticeship, I worked at a funeral home said to be haunted by an old funeral director assistant who had a heart attack in the building and died. All he ever did was mess with the chapel lights, and if you called him out, something like, "John, the family is coming. Please don't," they would return to normal. Not really sure if I believe it was really haunted, but saying something always fixed the issue, so I kept doing it my entire time there. My grandfather died a while back. One day me and a bunch of my cousins were playing in the front yard. Rural area. Since on weekends all the family likes to hang out together. So we're out having fun and see Lolo, grandfather, walking towards the house. We all greet him and he smiles at us. He walks up the porch into the house and hangs his hat by the door. We continue playing until we hear crying from the inside of the house and my uncle driving fast up the driveway. We all rush in to see what's going on and see everybody bunched up in the kitchen crying, telling us that Lolo died early that morning and they just found out. He lives a few towns away. We looked at each other and told the grown-ups, "Nah, we just saw him come into the house." They didn't believe us and we told them that he really did not that long ago, and he even hung up his hat by the door. So everybody rushes to the door and his hat was hanging right where we said it was. He doesn't ever go anywhere without that hat. So me and my cousins are running all over the house calling for him while our parents are so quiet and freaking out. He actually did die earlier that morning and my grandmother couldn't find his hat anywhere in their house. We left the hat where it was and nobody ever touched it. I'm a palliative care RN who didn't believe in this stuff until I became a nurse. I have 3 to share at the moment. 1. Before my time in palliative care, I worked on a medicine unit at the hospital. One night I was returning from my second break around 3 a.m. or so and saw a man standing in the door of my patient's room. He was white, late 40s to mid-50s. Dark hair which was graying. Relatively fit. Wearing a hospital gown. He was standing at the door with his arms crossed, and as I walked closer he turned and went inside the room. I followed because I knew it wasn't his room. Our unit was big, 36 beds. Said it was entirely possibly he was a patient I had not met yet. Anyway, you can guess the rest. Went inside the room and he was nowhere to be found. I looked under the beds. Ridiculous BC, someone couldn't hide there. In the lockers, washroom, behind the curtains. He was nowhere to be found. Later that night my coworker had said she felt like someone was touching her feet when she tried to nap on her break. The break room was right next door to my patient's room, and she was in there at the time that I saw this patient. 2. Not a specific ghost story, but I just want to say 2 things about working in palliative care. 1. Patients often introduce me to deceased relatives around them or talk about people waiting or being in the room with them. 2. A lot of people know they are going to die, and I believe much is seen, heard that folks don't talk about during this time. I believe this because in our younger patients who aren't ready to go, there is often a high degree of anxiety, and many times I have been asked by a younger patient to help me. I'm going to die today, or similar. 3. Once upon a time I was doing home hospice and a younger guy in his 50s was dying of occupation-related lung cancer. Anyway, I knew it was coming and asked his family if they wanted to invite anybody to say goodbye, so patient's 90-year-old father, brother, extended family and friends came over at about 1 a.m. and I left them and sat in the kitchen to give them privacy. As I'm in there I hear this massive burst of wind chimes, which was kind of supernatural. As in, did not stop. Just a massive burst that went on and on instead of trickling here and there with the wind. A moment later his daughter came in to tell me he had passed away. I don't usually share my supernatural beliefs about death, dying with families, but I couldn't help but comment on the wind chimes later on, and his wife said, "Yeah, he collected wind chimes. That doesn't surprise me at all," and turns on the light on the back patio, showing me literally hundreds of chimes which had been silent all night until he passed. Not a ghost story, but when I was in the army, I served on a few honor guard duties for transporting soldiers' remains. One time we were taking Korean War-era remains that had been uncovered in Korea and transported to the USA for identification. For most of the remains, the transfer cases, industrial aluminum caskets, were very light, like you'd expect with 40-year-old remains. A couple of the cases were heavy, like a couple 100 pounds. I've never stopped wondering what was in those cases. It wasn't 40-year-old bones. I used to be a nurse assistant on a cancer floor that also served as the hospice floor. The number of times a patient would pass and be removed from a room, only to have that room's call light continue to go off without anyone inside, was just nuts. And before you say maybe the light was just damaged or moved strangely in the process of removing the body, that's the only time it would happen. Broken call lights, in any other circumstance, just wouldn't come on at all. I used to work on an oncology ward as a nurse. Our side rooms were kept for end-of-life patients on palliative care, and one patient that we had been nursing for a good few weeks died early one morning. Last offices had already been done by the night staff and the patient moved to the hospital morgue. So all that remained was to clear the room of personal belongings and tidy up. I sent a student nurse that I was mentoring at the time to do this whilst I got on with the drug round. The student had known the patient fairly well and was comfortable with this job. About 10 minutes after, a colleague came to me and told me that my student had come flying out of the side room white as a sheet and was sobbing in the staff room. I went to find out what the problem was, and the student told me she had been clearing out sink area in the bathroom, had glanced up and seen the deceased patient reflected in the mirror looking at her over her shoulder. My student was a sensible girl. Not given to hysterics, but for the remainder of her placement on that ward she would not go near that side room. Back when I worked in cardiology, we had this one single room at the ass end or the floor. We'd put palliative patients or patients that needed isolation in there. I swear 3 different patients in the years I worked there told me they had woken in the middle of the night and seen an old man and a little girl holding hands, both standing at the foot of the bed, doing nothing. Edit. Wording. My roomie, best bud, is a mortician, and I'm around the funeral home a fair amount myself and know the staff pretty well. I've spent the night there before. Nothing weird happens there. I have had some experiences I can't explain, so I was a little surprised none of the staff ever had an odd experience. Especially since some of them do believe in ghosts and whatnot. But they told me, if ghosts were real, why in the world would they linger at a funeral home? It's just a transition space. Like an airport. No one wants to just stay in the damn airport. Haunt the place you died, or the people you love, or the home you never want to leave, or however it works. If it works. Who would want to linger in a funeral home they have no attachment to? That their body only visited after they already were gone? Not me, but my mom's ex's story. My grandpa was the mortician for a small town in the late 60s. The morgue was attached to the house that my mom lived in. That's just how it was, and it didn't bother her. One day her boyfriend, Tom, came over to the house and no one was home. They had been dating for a while and he was comfortable going inside and waiting for my mom to come home. On the way into the house, Tom noticed that the door and windows into the morgue were open. So he checked it out, found it empty, closed everything and went into the house. A few minutes later he heard a loud slamming noise come from the morgue. So he ran to see what was wrong and found that the doors and windows had been thrown fully open. Again. He got out of there real quick. When he told my grandpa about what happened, my grandpa just calmly explained that they had picked up Mrs. that morning and the spirits were there welcoming her and visiting with her. Next time Tom should just leave the doors and windows open. Roommate back in college was an intern at a coroner's office. Told me about a heavy-set guy that had been brought in that would pass gas loudly every time they moved it. Took the body a couple of days to run out of gas. Don't know if that's normal, but it creeped him out and I found it to be interesting to hear about. Obligatory. Haven't worked around death, burial, but as a part of my culture, we frequently visit the graveyard to pay respects to our deceased. My brother passed away when he was 8 months old from leukemia. He was born with it and eventually he was buried next to my grandmother who passed away over a decade later. My uncle would frequently visit her grave, but he also left little toy cars on my brother's grave. And once there was a new burial a few plots down and the family was holding Thier overnight vigils for Thier family member. When he stopped by our family plot, he was approached by a member of the other family. Apparently late at night they would see glimpses of a young boy playing around our family plot, but no one could approach him. My uncle looked over at my brother's grave and noticed that the toy cars were missing. Might be a little tangential, but bear with me. For many years, I was in the US Navy based in Japan. After the tsunami hit Fukushima, we spent a few months off the coast resupplying helicopters that were ferrying supplies and searching for bodies of people who were washed out to sea. When we did find a body, we were instructed to put them in a body bag and store those bags in an area called the starboard castleway, sheltered area outside of the pressurized interior, until a Japanese Coast Guard helicopter could come by to retrieve them. For a while after we were finished with that mission, some of my shipmates reportedly saw ghosts in that area of the ship. I didn't see any ghosts, but it was not uncommon for me to feel some unnatural chills there. I used to work as a nursing assistant in assisted living communities. Usually when a resident started to need hospice, they were transferred out to a higher level of care. So I didn't see death for a long time. When I first started, my favorite resident, let's call her Marilyn, would play Scrabble with me. She was completely alert and oriented. Sometimes she likes to sit quietly with an iPod shuffle clipped onto her vest and these huge headphones. She loved music. Slowly she started to decline. I would help her get ready for bed and she would get upset when she forgot how to do something. The only thing that calmed her down was playing music off my phone. She liked Frank Sinatra and the Beatles. Her independent ability declined rapidly and soon she was bedridden. Still, loved listening to music. This was during COVID, and her quality of life was diminishing so quickly that we didn't transfer her out. She had an apartment at the facility with all her belongings where she was comfortable. By the end, her dementia had progressed to the point that she couldn't remember how to swallow. Marilyn passed away with me, the head nurse, and her family at her bedside in her apartment. Unit 202. I did her post-mortem care afterwards. Styled her hair how she liked to wear it. Even clipped her little iPod onto her shirt. A few days after she died, a woman in 203, her neighbor, kept wandering into the lobby during night shift, always at 3 a.m. She complained of loud music coming from Unit 202. That apartment was vacant, just full of Marilyn's belongings. She said the music was so loud it was deafening. Whenever the night shift worker went to check, he didn't hear anything. Not really creepy, more sad. I miss Marilyn. I used to work in a nursing home. The residents in certain rooms would complain about a man in their room at night, but hallucinations are common in the elderly, so it wasn't really noticed. One night I was moping the dining room, which had huge windows overlooking the garden. It was around 1 a.m., so pitch black outside and low lighting inside. I had this horrible feeling of being watched, so looked up and reflected in the window was a man. Behind me, he had a brown suit in, a bowler hat, and the cruelest look on his face. He grinned and his mouth was too big. This happened in seconds, and when I turned around there was obviously no one there, but I'll never forget that look of evil on his face. I paid more attention to the residents after that, and they'd all seen the same man. He just enjoyed terrorizing people. My dad used to be a night shift guard in a hospital with a morgue in it. And on his shift a patient had died, and after all the cleaning up was done, a nurse had to stay alone with the corpse, but came back terrified and asked my dad to accompany her. Apparently the corpse was making strange noises. The noises were not really paranormal though. Apparently just gases passing, but probably a pretty spooky thing for a young nurse to experience alone. Also in the same building, my dad recalled a coworker hearing footsteps that followed her with a delay, kind of like an echo of her own footsteps during the night shift. Probably also nothing paranormal and just an actual echo in a relatively empty building, and a hint of imagination in the late hours. But who knows? Mom told me stories when I was growing up. Her first job out of nursing school was an RN in the ER of an old hospital in Virginia in the mid-1980s. There was the Man in the Hat and Patient 1. Most of the nurses had stories about them. The Man in the Hat would show up and stand outside of rooms after visiting hours. The patients often died soon after. Patient 1 was a woman in a very old hospital gown. She'd walk in the halls before entering random rooms those patients usually coded. They took the man to be an omen of death and the woman to be a heads-up to grab the crash cart.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.